Why Deep Blue Sea's ending made absolutely no sense. While I'm a huge fan of Deep Blue Sea, I do have my criticisms about the theatrical ending, particularly when compared to the original ending. The changes made, especially concerning Dr. Susan McAllister's fate, resulted in a conclusion that felt illogical and inconsistent with the rest of the film. Incorporating elements of the original ending into the final version might have made for a more coherent and satisfying resolution. Susan's death, a brilliant scientist's foolish decision. Dr. Susan McAllister was portrayed as a brilliant scientist, though the movie does not mention it outright. The screenplay establishes that she was the youngest scientist ever to receive a MacArthur grant. This suggests she was not only highly intelligent, but also innovative and resourceful. However, her death sequence completely undermines these qualities by having her make a reckless and irrational decision. In both the theatrical and original endings, Susan attempts to lure the genetically enhanced Gen 2 shark by cutting her hand and jumping into the water. However, a much simpler and less risky option was available. She could have just stuck her bloody hand into the water to attract the shark. If for some reason that didn't work, then jumping in could have been a last resort. Instead, her immediate decision to dive made little sense given her intelligence and understanding of the danger at hand. Some have labeled her actions as a noble sacrifice, but that interpretation doesn't quite hold up. If Susan had truly been sacrificing herself, she wouldn't have attempted to swim back to safety. Instead, her actions seemed more like a desperate attempt at problem-solving that went terribly wrong. Even worse, she should have known that Carter Blake, the expert shark wrangler, would instinctively try to save her, which he did. By doing this, she not only endangered herself but also Carter, which could have led to both of their deaths and left the fate of stopping the shark in the hands of Preacher, who was severely injured and incapacitated. Another aspect of the ending that stretched believability was Preacher's sudden ability to overcome his serious injury. Earlier, he was nearly bitten in half, rendering him barely able to move. Yet, in the final moments, he miraculously regains the strength to stand, climb a tower, and execute the plan to kill the last remaining shark. While adrenaline can certainly provide a temporary boost, the extent of his physical recovery was implausible. If his wounds were severe enough to leave him incapacitated just moments before, there is no way he could have accomplished such a physically demanding task. Even more baffling is how Preacher knew what to do. Carter had devised a plan to blow up the shark using a harpoon, but there were multiple logistical issues with this. First, Carter was not within shouting distance of Preacher when he came up with the idea. Second, Preacher was unconscious when Susan was tending to his wounds, meaning he had no knowledge of the harpoon's existence, let alone the mechanics of using it in conjunction with an electrical cable. Despite this, he somehow managed to locate the harpoon, carry it to the tower, and then connect the cable to the battery, all without prior knowledge of these elements. It was almost as if he had a divine revelation on what needed to be done, making it feel even more contrived. Another aspect is the absence of mourning for Susan. Once Preacher successfully kills the shark and saves the day, another issue arises: the complete lack of acknowledgement regarding Susan's death. Throughout the movie, every major character's demise is met with some form of grief or recognition from the survivors. Yet, Susan, arguably one of the most pivotal figures in the story, is given no such moment. Carter and Preacher simply carry on as if she never existed. What makes this even more unbelievable is that Carter and Susan had clear romantic tension. Earlier in the film, Carter essentially asks Susan out when he offers to buy her a beer, hinting at a potential relationship. A deleted scene in the bathroom, which was later cut after the ending was changed, further developed their connection. Even Scoggins alludes to their relationship in an earlier scene when he quips, "We got 1 or 2 sharks left, and there's you in the dock doing a little bathroom love." This suggests that, regardless of the audience's perception of Susan's character, Carter had a personal connection with her. For him to show no reaction whatsoever to her tragic demise contradicts the emotional beats established earlier in the film. Another aspect is Susan's ruined character arc. Susan was the only character with an arc going for her. She started as someone blinded by her ambition and determination to find a cure for Alzheimer's, even if it meant unethical experiments. Her journey throughout the film saw her beginning to recognize the consequences of her actions, setting her up for a potential redemption, only for it to be cut short by an illogical death that robbed the narrative of any meaningful resolution to her character's development. Some will claim her comeuppance was death, but in reality, losing her research was supposed to be her karma. Her life's work and the years of research she poured into developing the genetically enhanced sharks were completely destroyed, wiping out everything she had dedicated herself to. This loss would have been a fitting consequence for her moral transgressions, as she had defied ethical boundaries in her relentless pursuit of scientific breakthroughs. Watching everything she worked for crumble before her eyes would have served as the ultimate punishment, forcing her to confront the repercussions of her hubris. Instead, the film chose to remove her entirely, which not only felt excessive but also stripped the story of a more profound resolution to her arc. By making her face the fallout of her actions rather than outright killing her, the film could have reinforced the idea that scientific overreach and unchecked ambition have real consequences beyond just life and death. Her survival, paired with the complete destruction of her work, would have been far more poetic and thematically satisfying. It's also important to acknowledge that Susan, despite her morally questionable actions, had good intentions at heart. Unlike the scientist in Deep Blue Sea 2, who was arrogant and solely motivated by money and power, Susan's goal was to help people. She was driven by the desire to find a cure for Alzheimer's, a disease that affects millions. And while she took unethical shortcuts, she did so in the belief that the end result would justify the means. Her character wasn't about personal gain or megalomania, but rather a misguided determination to achieve a medical breakthrough. This makes her fate even more frustrating, as her downfall feels less like a meaningful consequence of her flaws and more like an arbitrary punishment designed to appease test audiences. Lastly, actions have consequences, but why is Susan viewed as a villain? It's undeniable that Susan's actions had severe consequences. Her reckless genetic modifications led to the sharks becoming hyper-intelligent and wreaking havoc. However, what's baffling is how she is framed as the film's villain when similar characters in other films, who also cause catastrophic events, were not treated with the same level of disdain. Take, for example, Dr. Susan Tyler from Mimic. She genetically engineered insects to wipe out disease-carrying cockroaches, only for them to evolve into dangerous predators. Like Susan McAllister, she had good intentions, but failed to consider the long-term ramifications of her work. Despite this, she was never vilified in the same way Susan McAllister was. Instead, she was portrayed as a scientist who made a mistake and worked to fix it. Another example is Rick Van Owen from The Lost World, Jurassic Park. He was responsible for freeing the dinosaurs from captivity, causing chaos and endangering human lives. Yet, he was not treated as a villain. If anything, he was framed as a morally ambiguous character who ultimately meant well. Unlike Susan McAllister, who actively tried to fix the problem she had created, Rick's actions were impulsive and reckless. Yet he still wasn't subjected to the same level of scrutiny. Even looking at other morally ambiguous scientists like Dr. Henry Wu from Jurassic World, who repeatedly played a role in creating deadly dinosaurs for personal and corporate gain, Susan's treatment seems unfair. Wu continuously made dangerous creatures for financial reasons and still wasn't immediately vilified. Meanwhile, Susan, who was trying to cure a debilitating disease, is punished more harshly. Susan McAllister's perceived villainy seems more a result of the film's need for a scapegoat rather than an earned narrative consequence. Yes, her actions had dire repercussions, but they were not driven by greed or recklessness. Unlike characters in other films who inadvertently caused destruction yet were allowed redemption, Susan was stripped of that opportunity, making her fate feel unjustified. Ultimately, Deep Blue Sea is an entertaining film that doesn't necessarily strive for realism. However, even within the realm of action horror movies, the ending felt particularly inconsistent and nonsensical. Susan's death was avoidable, Preacher's sudden recovery and knowledge were inexplicable, and the absence of grief for Susan's passing left an emotional void. Had the original ending been retained, where Susan survives, it would have made for a more coherent and satisfying conclusion. Instead, the theatrical ending leaves the audience with more questions than closure, undermining the film's otherwise engaging and thrilling narrative. Thank you for watching. I know some will disagree, as the ending is one of the most polarizing topics among fans of Deep Blue Sea. But I'm curious to hear everyone's thoughts, so let me know in the comments. And in closing, if you would like to see Deep Blue Sea's original ending, please be sure to sign the petition that is asking Warner to release it. A link can be found in the description, where you can simply Google Deep Blue Sea original ending petition. Thank you.